today, as you all know, we have a number of very renowned speakers, all of them political scientists, and we will be discussing how the discipline has managed to benefit or not so much from the Arab uprisings. I think many of us, both on the panel and in the audience, share a number of frustrations with the fact that such important and once in a lifetime events as the uprisings have not been reflecting their most potential on how the discipline not only engages with them, but reflections on the methodologies we use, on the issues we engage with, and on the questions we ask as students of the discipline. As I said, many of us, on the panel share those questions and frustrations, but also the belief in the potential of our discipline evolving to provide the kind of knowledge that we would want it to do. Speak truth to power, engage with things that are important to our Arab societies and Arab citizens and citizens of the world at large. I want to thank my co-organizers, Lisa Wadeen, the Chicago, I always get this wrong. So it is the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago. And my colleague, Amr Adli, from the Department of Political Science at the American University in Cairo, where I also work. I want to introduce and thank our amazing panelists for taking the time. Again, it's Ramadan. Some of them had to rush right after iftar, and others are, just interrupting their schedule. We are very grateful. So on behalf of my co-organizers, I want to thank them before I introduce them, though I also want to thank MK and Layla and all the staff of the project who supported all the technical issues and the logistics and whatever you guys see on the screen. So thank you guys so much. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers in the order they're going to be speaking. I'm going to make it very brief because they're all very accomplished and renowned, and it would take forever, and I don't want to waste more time. So today we have Nathan Brown. Nathan is a professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington University. He's a distinguished scholar and author of 4 well-received books on Arab politics. Brown, I was about to say Nathan. Brown is a very prolific writer, and one of the very interesting things about Nathan Brown is that his country expertise is actually diversified. So, Palestine, Egypt, and whatnot, but also the topics, whether it's Islamist movements, democratization, Arab law and constitutionalism. He can speak authoritatively to all of those, and hence his insights about the discipline are key today. We also have Larissa Chomyak. Larissa is the director of the Centre d'études maghrébines, Tunis. Again, I cannot pronounce it properly, but you know what I mean. Larissa received her PhD in political science in 2011. She had done extensive qualitative research in Tunisia, which she knows inside out, as well as the Ukraine. She's currently finishing her book manuscript on the politics of dissent under Ben Ali in Tunisia. And her work appeared in multiple journal articles in the Middle East Report, Middle East Law and Governance. We also have Amani Jamal, who is the Edward Sanford Professor of Politics at Princeton University and the director of Mamdouha Bobsit Center for Peace and Justice. Jamal is also many other things, you know, the Arab Barometer Workshop on Arab Political Development, former president of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies. And then he publishes very extensively on democracy. She has a number of books that focus on democracy, democratization, Islam, Islamization. She received her PhD from Michigan, and in 2005 was named a Carnegie Scholar. We also have Lama Murad, who is an assistant professor at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Her research focuses on the intersection of forced migration, local governance, and the politics of borders, with a regional focus on the Middle East. Murad was previously a postdoctoral fellow at University of Pennsylvania and Harvard University. Murad's work has been published in both academic and public outlets, including Journal of Refugee Studies, Middle East Law and Governance, Forced Migration, and the Washington Post, to name a few. Last but not least, we have Jillian Schwadler. And Jillian is the professor of political science at Hunter College and the Graduate Center and non-resident senior fellow at the Crown Center for the Middle East at Brandeis University. She is also co-founder and co-director with Larissa Chamiak of the Sidi Boussaid School of Critical Protest Studies, which will be launched in 2022. So without further ado, once again, thank you all for being here. I will leave it to my colleague, Amr Adli, who will be doing the nasty part of moderation and stopping speakers at the 9th minute. And I will come back when we have the Q&A, which also Amr is going to moderate, but I already have so many questions for my colleagues. Thank you, everyone. And Amr, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Rabab, for the great introduction. Thank you, everybody, for showing up, and thanks our dear panelists for agreeing to give us and to share their thoughts, to give us their talk, and to share their thoughts on this panel. So we will go by the order that Rabab mentioned, starting with Nathan. Yes, so Nathan, you have like 10 minutes. I know that you are punctual, so otherwise I'll just like try to remind you all using the chat, so keep an eye on it, okay? Thanks. Okay, Nathan, go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks for your vote in my punctuality, or your confidence in my punctuality, and thanks as well for your confidence in me and putting me on this panel. I'm wondering if that's the nasty part, because when you contacted me, Amr, you said we want to integrate perspectives from the global South, and I've never told you this, but I live in Washington, D.C. and work here. And then when I read the write-up, it was about sort of alternatives to institutional analysis. And I thought, well, I write on constitutions and courts, and I'm studying religion right now, but doing so through state religious institutions. So maybe the nasty thing was to set me up as a straw man. But when I think about it, actually, my presence here may not be totally inappropriate. And I'll explain why, first on a kind of a human level and then on a conceptual level. So I think I don't want to quiz people, but I would guess I'm the oldest person on this panel. And when I entered the field, it was a tail end, I think, of an era in which Middle East politics really was us studying them. It was people in American and sometimes European universities studying people in the Middle East. I mean, there was a border. The border was permeable, right? So people like Ibrahim Abu-Lughod could start in Palestine and then come to the United States. There were people who did field work, but this was us going to them. And I don't think that's the way the field operates so much anymore. When I put together my syllabi, there's, things from all over and so on. I'm not going to say that we live in a completely egalitarian world. What strikes me is now there's more gradient in terms of sort of a human capital, much more than the borders that existed before. It's not level. Resources are not level. Structural support, protection are not equally distributed. And actually, languages, I think, actually a pretty big factor. We're talking today in English, and most international scholarly discussion takes place still in English, which makes me very happy. But again, it's a language I'm fond of. But again, it creates some impediments, publishing opportunities and so on. So if we're switching from borders to gradients kind of on a personal level, what's happening on an intellectual level? And that's what really kind of intrigued me about the write-up for this panel. So it begins by, I think, kind of, or the write-up kind of challenges the idea that, as I would say, politics is about if politics ends. I mean, that's not explicitly said, but the way that the discipline has been moving very heavily towards causal explanation, to causal inference. In essence, what we're trying to do as a discipline increasingly is to explain outcomes, right? Why this happened. And when you do that, of course, you're sort of implying, wait, politics stops at this point, and we have to explain this as an outcome. My thinking on this is challenged sometimes by research on the region, some of it which comes out of the uprising, not all of it. Mona El-Khabashi has a book that's just coming out, I think, that basically kind of challenges this a little bit more kind of on epistemological grounds, but I commend it to your attention. But essentially, the idea that what had to be explained is something that fits into a transition, or as an article of mine once was titled, and I didn't challenge it, and I should have, Egypt's failed transition, right? That there was a process, and instead of getting A, you got B, and that's what has to be explained. But instead, allowing for continuation of politics and contingency. I'm reminded of Lisa Wedeen's work. Who's also on this panel, who's written on both authoritarianism and democracy. And I will put words into her mouth, which she's welcome to correct, but essentially looking at these things, authoritarianism and democracy, not simply as regime types, as outcomes. We have an authoritarian regime. How did it get there? Now that we know that it's authoritarian, how does it produce A, B, and C? But instead looking at them sort of encoded in human relationships and as embedded in those relationships, and starting politics not with explaining outcomes, but essentially understanding practice. In that sense, when I look at scholarship that is emerging, that comes out of the post-2011 period, it certainly has roots before, is that it's not that it favors subjectivity over objectivity, but it insists that you can't lose sight of one at the expense of the other. And I think that's distinctive, and I think that's a disciplinary contribution that is important and that is worth keeping. That said, and here I'm going to get slightly complicated and still try to keep it within 10 minutes. When I think back to the uprising, sort of the idea that there was something fundamental that had happened was not one that was just imposed by people who'd read, Linz and Stepan and so on, right? So there were the activists within the region, scholars within the regions, and sometimes the line between those overlapped quite heavily. Really, what I remember back from the 2011-2012 period was that something fundamentally has changed, right? We have to understand how this happened. There was an outcome, a felt outcome in that sense. Politics wouldn't be the same again. But even taking that seriously, essentially that subjectivity seriously is, I think, important. It helped me develop sort of a critique of Timur Kran's work on kind of protest cascades, where he, his famous article where he talks about preference falsification. And when I looked at this, I thought, what this doesn't get is a little bit of, and again, I'll refer to a much older work here, R.C. Zollberg's kind of moments of madness. There's something that happens in political moments which can't be reduced to individual preferences, that the shared subjectivities really matter and intrude on politics. So the sense that there was something fundamental changing. Whatever changed or didn't change, that sense actually changed not simply how people experienced politics, but how they acted. Okay, so there's a new way that I think emerges out of this, and not totally new, but I think it shifts the emphasis, as I say, to understanding politics as ongoing, to looking at practice, to encoding politics in human relationships as much as in structures and regime types. So is this going to change the discipline, contribute to the discipline? And here, everything I've said so far is kind of happy, good news. Borders have tumbled and given way to gradients, and we're all learning so much. But I'll just say there's two trends that worry me. I shouldn't say that worry me, but that seem to me as obstacles to this, that we don't pay enough attention to. The first is, okay, do the uprisings contribute to different disciplinary perspectives? Well, the fact is, when I look at what my colleagues are interested in when they're interested in the Middle East, their attention has wandered, right? It's about insurgencies, it's about political violence, it's about, I could go on the list of topics. And I think what's driving this, in part, is something that we don't actually factor into our understandings, but something like close to 1 million Americans have been sent to the Middle East in some kind of military security capacity over the last decade or so. That's huge. And it affects people's attention. It affects why students take our classes. It affects funding. It affects it when people are formulating their intellectual interests. Why are they interested in this? It affects them. And so in a sense, the attention's wandering. And the second thing that is happening are fraying networks. Most people here on this call know each other, and they know each other in person, but the networks, I think, began to fray even before COVID, and they frayed for a number of reasons, including the fact that international travel and scholarly exchange and field work is just much more difficult than it used to be, and the ways in which, as I say, I come up with a syllabus and naturally include, even I'm restricted completely to English, I'm still including works that are literally produced all over the world, right? And generally, the younger the author, the more likely they're going to be based in the region. This is not my policy. This is just the effect. I'm worried about that trend continuing. I'm worried about the trend of those human contacts that have been so essential in transforming the free field, fraying without our noticing it and without our really doing so much to work against it. So on that kind of sad ending, non-Hollywood ending, I think my 10 minutes are up.
Thanks a lot, Nathan. So let's move to Larissa.
Thank you. Thank you to Rabab, Lisa, and Amr for organizing this event, and thank you, of course, for inviting me to partake and also to share a few thoughts. I shall focus on three main points in my remarks, all linked to the question in the concept note about the disconnect between real-life events and mainstream political science. Some of these ideas I developed in greater detail in my book manuscript that Rabab mentioned, Archipelagos of Dissent, which analyzes Tunisian politics from the late 1990s to the present. So I should say right ahead of time that a lot of my examples are going to come from the Tunisian case in the next few minutes. My first point today is the idea of Tunisia as a democratic exception to the region's authoritarianism, an instance of a successful transition amidst the failed uprisings elsewhere. In critiquing this obsession, we can clearly also see limitations in work on regime type, generalizability, and ripple effects. We can also see the problem this penchant for reading Tunisia as an exception has on recognizing the actual idiosyncrasies and particularities of states, experiences, and histories. The second point is what I think of as the political work of public opinion surveys, particularly those conducted and published in Tunisia, which together with media work have contributed to an important public space in which respondents separate a world before the uprisings from the political present, as though they are fully discrete universes. And the third is how these tensions have conflated democratization, often viewed by Tunisians themselves as the source of frustration, with the revolution, conversely, often viewed as a source of hope, and the implication that conflation has for the real life events we seek to understand. So to my first point as about the democratic exception. Here I want to borrow from Mona Abbas's essay on the rush of scholars to examine the 2011 uprisings. Her critique, Academic Tourist Sightseeing the Arab Spring, nicely sums up a decade-long process of democracy sightseeing in Tunisia. That is, how mainstream social science continues to tack Tunisia onto comparisons as a case study, a qualitative example to complement large N work, which looks at patterns to predict, a comparison to be replicated, a foil to understand authoritarian resurgence elsewhere, or a specific policy example determined from the outset to protect Tunisia's supposed democratic success. The critical point developed in Abbas's essay is that scholars from the North rely on local interlocutors from the South to show or observe complex events and processes quickly, and this reliance has perpetrated the idea that Tunisia is an exception. Besides the troublesome practice of outsourcing knowledge acquisition and narrating research on behalf of the principal investigator, troublesome because the analytical and explanatory elements of research relies on someone else's understanding of what is going on, this reliance also serves to produce the democratic exception narrative. When the focus is solely on providing, on proving that Tunisia is a democracy, especially by the kind of cheap comparison to war, conflict, and violence elsewhere, large real-life events are mostly completely washed out. 2011 provided an extraordinary opportunity for political scientists to engage with the histories, experiences, dreams, desires, languages, and societal conflicts of individual countries, while also bringing these insights into the disciplines, approaches, and methods, thereby generating important competing as well as complementary ways to produce knowledge. From my own academic experience in Tunisia, I thought that the revolution would produce just that for academic research, a desire to engage with what the people are actually doing, and not to rely almost exclusively on what James Scott called in a 2013 interview with Christian Davenport as conducting social science behind people's backs. My second point is to think about the idea registered in public opinion surveys over the last decade, that it was better before the revolution. Questions in these surveys produce a periodization that structures how respondents think about the revolution. These findings have been solidified in a highly politically divided Tunisian media sphere. The powerful production of how respondents think about the past, I believe, has created new categories of analysis that pit an uncomplicated before against a frustrated present. Already in 2012, just a year after the revolution, a major Tunisian newspaper published findings that 42% of Tunisians missed the Ben Ali era. Subsequent surveys in 2013 and 2014, during the height of the political crisis, not just here, but elsewhere as well, asked whether Tunisians regretted the fall of the regime and of Ben Ali, whether Ben Ali governed the country better than today's rulers, or whether respondents agreed that the revolution has deepened social disparities between rich and poor. By political work, I mean the public playing field that is made possible through this kind of knowledge production. How various forms of political science inquiry, along with local media, sustain this playing field, and how this stark binary in attitudes between past and present confuses what public commitments to democracy mean. In my book, I show how such questionnaires, coupled with global surveys that report on diminishing trust in democratic institutions, actually contribute to overall frustrations with the political present. Surely the economy and demands for dignified redistribution are important to understanding frustration, but these frustrations cannot be reduced to a narrow economistic argument. I write about how the practice of lumping together the concepts of uprising, revolution, and democracy by anti-revolutionaries, and that is through surveys, through media talk shows, through commentaries, and various other public venues, become a space of producing nostalgia for an authoritarian past. This powerful trend within democratization work has conflated terms and even memory and rendered a pared-down reading that citizens are unsatisfied with democracy. These details signify the political work that is at stake. By insisting that Tunisia is a case of successful democratization, from method to normative commitment, we reproduce the constraints of regime category research and prioritize minimalist procedural gains, notably elections. This political work also silences dissent and forecloses a discussion of democratic difference. It also forecloses discussions of large-scale rejections of the predatory political economy that has gone hand in hand with democratization so far, and of citizens opting for the street rather than the institutions that have been prescribed, as we witnessed in January and February of just this year. I would like to end my comments with a real-life example, an effect of the kind of tensions I mentioned so far. The construction of a before-after political life in which a new democratic present, one that is categorized as a democracy in crisis, a democracy under threat, a democracy that could derail, also depends on its juxtaposition to an unproblematic authoritarian past. The nostalgia among some Tunisians for the previous era, for the ancien regime, with a complete dismissal of its violent and repressive practices, has given rise to a new type of political figure. For example, rising star candidate Abir Moussi relies on a rhetoric of the past, on violent and derogatory speech against her opponents, on a self-aggrandizing way to live stream her own attacks, usually with a megaphone, on other members of parliament and government, all to build her political potential in a context that has made this possible. Her version of telling the truth is her practice of providing unfiltered images and sequences of her aggressive interactions with political opponents on social media. What she claims to be unfiltered and uncensored information of calling others out and thereby providing truth is also the primary source of her appeal. Analysis of Tunisian politics have fallen victim to political science's obsession with democratic procedural gains. Absent is an analysis of the conditions under which a glorification of the previous dictatorship has been made possible. How public longing and nostalgia for an old order was reintroduced. This condition is what The Economist has referred to last week as anti-democratic candidates on the rise. Political science cannot and indeed does not adopt neutrality when partaking in how democracy versus dictatorship is viewed. Political scientists appear to not be involved in the tremendous anxiety that Tunisians navigate daily. This unawareness has consequences for our theorization about politics. So to conclude, my point is that the domination of democratic exceptionalism, survey research, and under-theorized relation of past to present have flat out failed in capturing both what is happening and what those living through these moments understand to be happening. By focusing on the science of it, political science sometimes misses the politics. Thank you very much again.
Thanks a lot, Larissa. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for keeping to the time. Amani, would you like to jump in?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amr, and thank you, Lisa and Rabab, for organizing. And it's always a great pleasure to be joining my colleagues here on this panel. What I thought I would do is, Rabab and Lisa prepared such an eloquent sort of summary for the panel, for the panelists to follow. And as I was thinking about what I would say, I sort of just thought about some of the factors that have, as you know, we've been reflecting in this series on 10 years since the Arab uprisings. There are a few factors that have always sort of bothered me and continue to sort of annoy me in terms of how we've studied the Arab uprisings or been asked to study or reflect on the Arab uprisings. So this is why this panel in particular is sort of a breath of fresh air to sort of be able to sort of critically assess how we've been thinking about the Arab uprisings over the last decade. So I think for me, the one thing that I immediately was struck by almost immediately after the Arab uprisings, and I think both Nathan and Larissa mentioned this as well, is that almost like a week after the Arab uprisings, we were asked to assess whether the Arab uprisings were successful or whether they were going to fail. Like that was immediately, almost every conversation, whether it was journalistic or in the mainstream or quite even in the academic, it was like everybody was on this bandwagon to assess the success and failure, not realizing that even in the canonical works on democratization, on revolutions, on transitions, on protests, social movements, all of that, this binary outcome of success and failure and trying to reduce the Arab uprisings to a binary outcome as such was really just misplaced. And in a way, I do believe that for the Arab uprisings themselves, this had sort of immediate consequences because as the Arab uprisings were sort of also looking for wider audience, wider support, maybe international support, as pundits and analysts began assigning terms like failure, they're not ready for democracy, all of that all the jargons and the discourses, it really meant that fewer and fewer sort of maybe actors were going to throw their hat behind the Arab uprisings. And I'll come back to that. But again, I think, in a sense, not appreciating what we know from the discipline, what we know from transitions, from democratization, from processes around democratization or regime consolidation. In many cases, these are very new states, weak states, trying to still solidify and consolidate. And the fact that we were just assigning, looking at the outcomes without paying attention to the specific processes underlying the protests and what they meant, I think that was something that I've always been bothered by. Another thing that so I have a list of 4 things that I'm going to address and try to do in 10 minutes. The second thing that I was sort of perplexed about throughout, and maybe still am, is that from the very beginning, not only was there this attempt to assign whether or not the outcome was success or failure, but there was an immediate attempt to characterize the entire nature of the protest, right? All of a sudden, immediately, the protests themselves became secular, a youth generation that was rejecting the old and traditional baggage of their parents and their older generations, and they were rejecting authoritarianism and embracing democracy. So again, this bundle of modernization attributes, all placed in one baggage, not necessarily empirically substantiated, not sort of recognizing that people have underlying grievances that didn't have to map onto these neoliberal sort of hegemonic tropes. But the fact that the fact what happened was that these were erected and solidified and promoted as, okay, democracy is now coming to the Arab world, when that clearly that people, citizens and political elite and all the invested actors and interests were trying to figure things out. People became very disillusioned with the Arab uprisings, right? Like, what do you mean there's a debate about the nature of the democracy? What do you mean they haven't figured out the institutional makeup of the elections? What do you mean they don't have the right formulas for adequate representation and who's going to sit at the table, and they don't have the constitution already in their back pocket? All of a sudden, there was no patience or tolerance for state building and institution building and democratic state building in that sense. So, and as actors entered the fray, right, that were not secular and young and youthful and Western educated, it became all the more problematic for a lot of people. So there was this idea that if it doesn't conform to the Western Eurocentric model of democratization, which, mind you, there's a lot of debate on, and there's not like necessarily a monolithic narrative there, then if it doesn't conform to that, then anything short of that is going to be a democratic failure. So that's the second thing that I've also sort of always sort of just lamented and been saddened by. The third thing, and relatedly, was the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab uprisings. And what do I mean by this? I mean, for the longest time, it was unclear what role the Muslim Brotherhood should play. Will they play a role? And if they did play a role, would they be democratic or non-democratic, right? So basically the Muslim Brotherhood, in its complexity, in its diversity, in its heterogeneity, was reduced to, again, another binary: democratic, secular, or non-democratic, theological, in ways that are going to be very regressive. And I remember having conversations as the Muslim, when it became clear that the Muslim Brotherhood was going to do well in the Egyptian elections. I remember, people would say, why should Obama support the Arab uprisings? The Egyptians have failed American democracy promotion. Look at the Muslim Brotherhood is going to win the election, so it's already sort of written off. I remember having to say things like, well, my colleague at AUC, Rabab al-Mahdi, Western educated woman, is actually advising the Muslim Brotherhood in some capacity or another. I don't know, Rabab, how much you speak about this, but I remember having to go out of my way to say, look, you have other segments of the Egyptian political landscape trying to figure out how the democratic process is going to unfold. And immediately that was basically shut down, turned off, basically dismissed. So again, not understanding the complexity and what the Muslim Brotherhood meant in Egypt in terms of its networks, its civil society penetration, even the role of religion in politics in Egypt. I think that was a big lost opportunity for us to sort of figure out what's going on. Moving forward, in terms of how we study the Arab uprisings 10 years afterwards, I think that the three last points I want to emphasize. I think, and I think all of you agree. Lisa has written about this, but all of you guys have written on this in your various capacities, in different works. Is getting at the politics of everyday resistance, right? Getting at this politics of everyday resistance, better understanding the role of sequencing and process tracing, and not monocausality but multi-causality in terms of thinking about outcomes. I think that's really important. And any empirical strategy, whether you work in ethnography or qualitative methods or quantitative, I think just trying to keep an open mind around these issues is really important for understanding what's going on the ground. I, like Nathan, am very concerned, and people have heard me say this, because field work is becoming less and less prized in the discipline, and let alone in Middle East studies where it's much more difficult to navigate the Middle East. I'm really worried about the ability of the future generation of students to continue to do solid research on the ground in ways that reflects the everyday politics of resistance. Three last points, Amar. I think I'm still within the time. Social media, I think, is an arena that we have to better understand in the Arab world, thinking about like WhatsApp, Facebook. A lot of times people are spending a lot of time just doing these big data downloads and then, using text classifiers that sort of are not necessarily emanating from on the ground fieldwork experience. I'd like to see better fieldwork informed topic models. I think political psychology is going to be really important field moving forward also in the region, if we're interested in understanding micro level processes, which I think is going to be fundamental. And then finally, I'm very excited when I hear that Larissa and Jillian are going to start the protest center, because this is exactly, again, getting at the micro foundations, how people are thinking about protest and resistance. This is exactly what we need to be doing. And the fact that you guys are doing it in the region is something that I also applaud. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Amani. Shall we move to Lama? Lama, right? Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you to Rabab and Lisa and for inviting me today. I feel, I said this to Lisa in an email, but I feel incredibly humbled to be on this panel with, colleagues and scholars that I admire so much and that I still feel I have so much to learn from. So, in addition to sort of being very junior on this panel, I also want to kind of caveat that I, unlike my colleagues here, haven't actually done work on the uprisings per se. Rather, I'm going to focus on what in the concept note and the sort of introduction of this panel was talked about as sort of one of the reverberations of the uprisings. In particular, as a scholar of displacement, I want to look at the way in which the uprisings and their aftermath have spurred one of the largest mass displacements in the history of the region, and how these movements of people have been understood and studied in political science, and how that relates to the study of the uprisings as well. So again, in line with sort of, I think, a central goal of this discussion today, which is to reflect on the ways in which the uprisings are, complex, extended, and multifaceted processes of sociopolitical transformations, I want to focus on three challenges that I and others, who work on displacement see in existing political science scholarship on the displacement of millions of people in the region post-2011. So the first of these challenges is something that I think many of you have identified broadly as a challenge in the study of the uprisings more broadly, but it's a sort of a deep presentist bias. And that's something that, I truthfully, still struggle quite a bit with in my own work. And that's, while it's not wrong to, highlight the, unprecedented nature of the uprisings and similarly sort of the unprecedented perhaps scale of the displacement in the Middle East today, it's also really important that this not dehistoricize both the movement of populations, similar or nationalities historically, but also not erase the longer history and earlier cases of massive and often violence-triggered population movements in the region, right? So a similar sort of presentism, I think, appears in both natures of both kind of areas of research. And so, in the case that I know best, in the case of Lebanon, what would it mean, for instance, to see the arrival of over 1.5 million Syrians to Lebanon post-2011, not as an anomalous and potentially unique challenge that has faced the Lebanese state, but what would it look like to place it in a broader history of selective inclusion and exclusion of different groups within the country? And that could be Syrians, prior to 2011, but also Palestinians, Armenians, migrant domestic workers, and also other, national groups within the country. And to think about how governance in these different arenas may not be related strictly to legal categories, but to other forms of belonging and segmentation within the population. And the second challenge, I think, in this area, and it also relates to some of the sort of challenges of binaries and fixedness of categories that you all have talked about here. And that's sort of the unreflective adoption of policy categories often as our categories of analysis, and also kind of reifying binaries that are often much more complicated on the ground. That's definitely the case in, with the sort of primary binary in forced displacement, which is the binary between refugee and migrant. But it's also the case in an often seen binary in the study of the uprisings, which is the activist, non-activist, or activist civilian sort of binary. And this belies, I think, the complexity of how people experience their own identities in the context of the uprisings, but also in the context of displacement, and how that changes over time, how different authorities, whether international, national, or local, understand and leverage these different categories and forms of classification for different purposes and different aims. And here, I think political science can really learn from other fields. Refugee studies, I think, is really, done a lot of work to sort of break down the binary of refugee and migrants, and how classification, particularly, study in sociology, for instance, have done this for a long time, how classification operates to structure hierarchies of deservedness, for instance, or of belonging. And on the category of activist in particular and its relationship to displacement, which I think is obviously very important for our discussion today, there's a danger, I think, in fixing activism and mobilization, both spatially within the boundaries of whatever nation state we're thinking about, or whether country case, and temporally in the period of the uprisings themselves, however we want to sort of temporally define that, right? So as Nathan mentioned earlier, there's sort of a desire to sort of fix the temporal landscape there. And doing that would have us ignore other spaces and potential forms of activism that emerge in the process of displacement itself, and that may have relationships with other types of activism, prior to displacement. And here I'm thinking of the work of Rana Khouri in particular, who examines the relationship between international aid and civilian activism across the Syrian warscape, and sort of how it relates and transforms over time in the process of displacement. And I want to sort of spend a bit of time here to think about, whether it might be justified, I think, at times to look at particular forms of mobilization, say protest, right, to understand how they emerge and what kind of subjectivities they might generate. It's also important that we not deny people's own understandings of what is resistance and what is a challenge to a regime, and what that regime is, right? So here, I think a lot about Marwan Kraidi, who really pushes us to think about how regime is not just about, a particular dictator or a particular government, but also a system, right? So what other forms of activism, whether they be LGBTQ activism or other forms of activism that are happening, that consider themselves as part of a process of resisting a form of governance or a system. And finally, I want to highlight, an important, I think, relationship between the study of displaced populations and the study of the uprisings is really the way in which displaced populations, particularly Syrians, but not only, have often become sort of proxies for research on the uprisings themselves, particularly when access to the country, as is the case in Syria, becomes really difficult over time. And this, has really important ethical issues. And I think, that has been discussed, I think, quite often and at length, but it's also important to talk about the sort of analytical and substantive issues that come from drawing our understandings and our findings from sort of a particular set of populations that, have left and who are, whose subjectivities also in relationships to their home country are changing over time. And so some of this, the research in this vein does this sort of contextualization very well, and it situates like the limits and what kind of voices are being brought forward in this research. Of course, the work of Wendy Perlman here is sort of high up in this regard. But nonetheless, it's critical that we interrogate how, alternative methodological choices and methods can open up new questions about different populations and different choices within, in the midst of the uprising. And so, of course, I'm thinking here of Lisa Wedeen's latest book and the sort of ways in which we can understand different choices and mechanisms of the uprising through other mediums rather than just sort of interviews of refugees and displaced people. And so, these three challenges, I think, bring forward the way in which the study of displacement and displaced populations are intertwined with some of the challenges of studying the uprisings. But as we try and understand the reverberations, if not necessarily the consequences of the uprisings, it's important that the study of displaced populations also not be disconnected from, the history of displacement more broadly within the region, but also the politics of continued engagement of these populations with creating new communities in the places that they find themselves in, but also in connections to their homeland. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Lama. Thanks. So let's move to Jillian, and then we can open the floor for questions. Go ahead, Jillian, please.
Thank you, Rabab, Amr, and Lisa for inviting me to participate in the panel. And Lama, you've just shown us why we have so much to learn from you. So you clearly should be here, and I'm grateful you are. For me, in most political science accounts of the Arab uprisings, the driving questions have been and continue to be why uprisings occurred in some places but not in others, and why they took the forms they did. Waves of protests are examined through an analytic temporality that brackets the analysis around the life cycle of the protests. This is what Lama had just mentioned. When it started, how it evolved, and how it ends. These waves of protests are then treated as independent cases, and analyses aim to explain variations among those cases. Why was Tunisia's uprising successful while Egypt's was not? Why did the uprisings in Syria and Libya descend into civil war? Why did most monarchies not have uprisings? One familiar conclusion is that despite these variations, all of the uprisings ultimately failed, except for Tunisia's tentative transition to democracy. But I find this approach limiting at best, and at worst, it leads to inaccurate accounts of events and thus faulty theorizing. Of course, not all analyses of the uprisings treat them spatially and temporally as bounded units, but that approach lingers and remains common, and that's why I think we should take a closer look at its weaknesses. According to the scope conditions set by many analyses, focusing on success or failure of the uprisings, Jordan is usually classified as not having had an uprising. It's a failed case. Despite the tens of thousands who demonstrated nationwide for January and February in 2011, including Jordanians of both Palestinian and East Bank descent, despite its March 24th encampment inspired by Tahrir that was violently dispersed, led to death, and riot police and counter-protesters physically removed the encampment, despite hundreds of protests that continued over the next 2 years, including tens of thousands that were violently dispersed in 2012. But it's a failed case. My suggestion here, though, is not that Jordan should be moved into the category of countries that had an uprising, but that we should simply look beyond these success-failure models. What if, Instead of treating the uprisings as spatially and temporally bound units of analysis, we examine protests from the standpoint of people in the region and ask, how do they understand the escalation of protests during the period of the uprisings? What political processes and struggles does this approach bring into view? Instead of seeking to explain variation across cases, what if we situate the uprisings in a context of long-term repertoires of protest, claim-making, and repression, and identify repertoires and patterns that are local and cross-national and regional scales? To do so, we'd want to bring into view the multiple understandings of social cleavages among people in the region, and to explore how they're related to economic and political power structures. And we would want to be attentive to the interconnections of economic and security arrangements at both the regional and global scales. I offer such analysis in my forthcoming book, Protesting Jordan, Geographies of Power and Dissent. It's out in 2022 from Stanford. So in the remainder of my time, what I wanted to do was outline just two pieces of that argument, but to illustrate how an alternative approach to analyzing the uprising period can not only help us better understand politics in Jordan and across the region, but help us gain new theoretical insights. Jordan was created through a Hashemite British colonial project, and state making was not a smooth process. Bedouin revolts in the 1920s and 30s created so many problems for the would-be centralized authority that it could not quiet them, or they could quiet them only by providing permanent employment. Settled tribes during the same period, frustrated in part by favoritism towards rival tribes, also revolted as a means of making claims on the regime. Those revolts were violently put down by British forces, and that violence is remembered today. Over time, and through a combination of cash payments, jobs, and land grants, East Bank tribes did come to support the new Hashemite regime. East Bank communities refer to their support for Hashemite rule as a social contract, but the contract has been strained in recent years, particularly by Jordan's agreements with the IMF, which require it to lift subsidies and cut the very government jobs to which East Bankers feel entitled. In response to these multiple austerity measures, East Bank communities have sparked violent nationwide revolts on multiple occasions since 1989, forcing Kings Hussein and later Abdullah to repeatedly dismiss the cabinet and call for national dialogue. When Abdullah finally took the throne in 1999, he was not popular among East Bank tribes. He spoke poor Arabic and he sat stiffly among them. When he launched an accelerated privatization drive, East Bankers saw only corruption. Many of them live in poverty in the outlying governorates, and they watch billions pour into Amman and Aqaba for gleaming mega projects and upgraded infrastructure. But privatization per se is not necessarily a problem. Really, they feel that the Amman-based Palestinian bourgeoisie is disproportionately benefiting from it. All of this sets the stage for the period of the uprisings. In 2010, the Association of Military Veterans, including retired East Bank officers who are usually regime stalwarts, issued a manifesto that criticized the king and queen, which is illegal under several laws. They expressed grievances about corruption, neoliberalism, and the regime's failure to resolve the Palestinian problem. Multi-sectoral protests had been escalating for several years, including by teachers, dock workers, factory workers, and day wage laborers. But the scathing and unprecedented Veterans Manifesto strengthened resolve to escalate demands on the regime. When the Tunisian uprising began in late 2010, therefore, Jordanians who were already engaged in ongoing processes saw an opportunity to escalate and unite, eventually with tens of thousands taking to the street weekly, beginning the first Friday in January, weeks before Egypt's protests began. But because Jordanians were calling for reform of the regime and not the fall of the regime, many political scientists did not understand their political importance. Most troubling for King Abdullah were the youth-based Hirak, a collection of localized protest movements from East Bank communities, and not the usual cast of activists. As King Abdullah watched leaders from across the region fall, the regime engaged in a frantic effort to quell the unrest through jobs, cash payments, and promised new development programs. Some prominent activists were offered government posts, others were repeatedly jailed. But since the period of the uprisings, the Hirak groups have become increasingly willing to directly criticize the king, and its members are leading or joining hundreds of small protests and large protests every year, including up to last week. So having presented a view of Jordan's uprising period from the standpoint of East Bank Jordanians and their grievances, let's add another angle, one that scales up to bring into view some regional and global factors that profoundly shaped the uprising period across the region and not just Jordan. Jordan's political stability is critical to a US-centered regional security arrangement. With few industries or natural resources, it has survived largely as a semi-rentier state, heavily reliant on foreign aid. Pete Moore goes as far to characterize Jordan as a US protectorate, one that effectively is unable to make budgetary decisions without approval from Washington. With Jordan's escalation of protests in 2011, and in consideration of the uprising spreading across the region, the United States and Saudi Arabia poured aid into Jordan to bolster its economy and allow the government to pay salaries, predominantly to East Bankers in the bloated public sector. Jordan sent hundreds of gendarmerie troops to help crush the Bahrain uprising, after which the Bahraini regime urged the GCC to consider inviting Jordan to join. They didn't invite them. Rumors spread in Jordan as well that one of its own gendarmerie officers in Bahrain had originated the idea that Bahrain should dismantle the sculpture at the Pearl Roundabout. Gulf investments in Jordan increased over the next year, with Jordan's security services closely allied with those in the Gulf. But Gulf funding to Jordan, and indeed to anywhere in the region during this period and after, should be understood in the context of efforts by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Turkey to exploit the political turmoil of the uprising period and to increase their own regional influence. And finally, Jordan runs 3 military training centers, including one for counterterrorism, that was built by the Department of Defense with Department of Defense funds and is run by US contractors. One of that facility's popular courses, completed by riot police from every part of the globe, including from the US police forces, is crowd control and dispersal. So with US backing, Jordan is profiting from teaching other nations the latest techniques for crushing protests. There's much more to my analysis of Jordanian politics during this period of the uprising. And indeed, my book examines 150 years of protest in the Transjordanian area. But I hope to have shown that with only these 2 lines of inquiry, that is long-standing tribal East Bank grievances and Jordan's regional and global entanglements, that assessments of Jordan's uprising as a spatially and temporally bound failure as an object of analysis, such conclusions just fall really far short of advancing either our empirical or our theoretical knowledge. So to conclude then, the example from Jordan offers a corrective to political scientists who are fixated on questions of success and failure by attuning us to ongoing processes of protest and the ways in which regional entanglements shape and are shaped by protest. Jordan also undercuts social movement literature's orientation toward the life cycle analysis by showing us how those analyses fail to describe the everyday experience of contention at the subnational variation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jillian. Well, thank you all really for the fascinating presentations. Let's move directly to the Q&A session. We have half an hour. Everyone, like the participants, please, you have a box down there with the Q&A. So just write down your questions, and we can like have a couple of rounds, just like compile questions so that we can save time. We don't have much time if we have so many questions. If not, we can just like tackle these questions as they come. So
can I speak a question as opposed to writing it in the chat, since
Please go ahead, Lisa. Please.
It will make it easier. Thanks. This was a wonderful panel, and on behalf of the Chicago Center for Critical Contemporary Theory, there are actually 4 C's in there. I get it wrong too sometimes, Rabab. This has been really wonderful, and Lama, your presentation. We often say at the center that we want to theorize the present without being presentist, and you, everyone on the panel, in fact, gave us ways of doing that. And some of them that I wanted to underscore is thinking about a longer durée and situating whatever our themes are or our countries of interest in broader histories. Both you and Jillian made that point particularly. Also to think comparatively without producing invidious distinctions, to also think about, as Jillian was suggesting, multiple scales and various forms of temporality, being maybe multi-sided without doing the kind of traditional comparative politics research. And you said also, Lama, that resistance need not be immediately transformative, or that's what I took from it, but it's where, and this is dear to my heart, political vitality resides in the present. So I really appreciated that aspect of it. I have questions for Larissa and Nathan and Amani, but everyone else should feel like they can jump in as well. The question for primarily Nathan and Amani is, you both spoke about causal work in political science, and I wanted you to say a little bit more about recent trends in political science in relationship to causality, because in fact, political scientists, both in the mainstream and not necessarily in the mainstream, have often been interested in questions of cause. But the new AI, big data, computational modeling techniques are a new effort, it seems to me, to transform the discipline. And I wanted you to say something about what you see their effect on Middle East politics research being. Whether this is one of those rejected outright, or what are the kinds of salutary and also detrimental aspects of this research. And for Larissa, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about Abir Musi. And when you were talking, I was fascinated by, it was a brilliant presentation, I was fascinated by the relationships to forms of global authoritarianism elsewhere. And you argue for not the uniqueness necessarily of Tunisia, but the specificities of Tunisia. But I'm also wondering whether there's something that Tunisia can teach, say, you know, I hate the global north, global south bifurcation, but say Europe and the United States about its own efforts to wrestle with what now in the literature is termed democratic erosion, or forms of what I call global authoritarianism. So it'd be great to hear what you have to say about it. Thank you all for such a stimulating panel.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. So please.
So Larissa, why don't you go first?
I was just going to suggest so, yes.
Okay, as I'm scribbling really quickly. Lisa, I love the idea that you put this, that it is not just about, it's not this kind of like idiosyncratic moment that cannot be compared, which is certainly not the point that I wanted to make overall. The idea is not to get rid of comparative politics or the discipline, but to think about what it is that we're comparing. And for the case of Abir Musi, one of the interesting things about her vis-a-vis the question of global authoritarianism is the way in which she presents herself. And again, I don't mean to make a cheap comparison after I just criticized comparison, but she is certainly presenting herself as a Democrat, and powerfully so. Her party is polling as the highest in parliament right now. She herself as a candidate is not polling as, she's not doing that bad. She's nowhere close to the current president, but her party is working, and her work in parliament is working quite well. So I think what's an interesting thing to perhaps think about comparatively or globally is the power in the co-optation of the language of someone like her. I'm thinking, for instance, how Trump in the beginning said that he is creating a social movement. So taking the language away and doing something with that language that is very different from the actual practice, which the Economist article last week called fascist practices. And of course, her response was that she copied that article on her Facebook page with a picture of her megaphone, with a picture of all her members of parliament with a megaphone, questioning not just the article, but also the former US ambassador who shared it. So there's a kind of struggle over the meaning of what these terms mean. She is saying she's rescuing democracy. The current president ran on a campaign that was rescuing the revolution. So there's a way in which these terms are used powerfully that I think can be traced. I don't know about compare, but can certainly be traced globally.
Thanks a lot, Larissa. Anyone among the panelists might be interested in addressing Lisa's question?
Nathan, you want to say something? I'd be happy to chime in. I just want to make sure
Yeah, I was afraid I was going to get called on because I'm not sure I can answer Lisa's question because the literature that she's talking about are not ones that I'm all that literate in. So I'm going to answer the question not in intellectual terms, but partly in human capital terms. I think that's sort of where the field is going, and I think it will have effects. In what I was saying earlier, when I look at people's career trajectory, there was a generation of scholars who I think often got their disciplinary training after some deep regional experience they got in various kinds of ways. They grew up there. They were sort of bicultural families, moved back and forth. They did language training and so on. And that's what I think may be getting attenuated, right? So that the training that people will get, we got much better language training for non-native speakers than we used to have, I think. So language skills are good, but an awful lot of, as I say, sort of those human terms, people who've studied in the region, worked in the region, that is what I think the next generation is going to be a little bit poorer in. So they're going to be well methodologically trained in those ways. Let me make one other comment, sort of based on the other contributions that I heard on this panel, that was based on something, Lisa, you said that wasn't in your question to me, and you said something, and I don't remember the phrase, the way that we do political science. And that's kind of what I'm hearing from the other participants here. They're describing kind of how political science is done, and sort of the broader arguments emerge from the practice of political science. And there's something explicit that I want to draw attention to that may be implicitly behind some of the comments here. And that is, nobody here is resistant, that I can hear, to doing comparative politics, to saying comparisons can be made. The worry that I have, and I think I may share this with others, although I'm going to put this only in my own words, is that a lot of the conceptual categories that we have come from not so much comparative work, but idealized and not necessarily all that helpful understandings of specific historical experience of specific societies, Western Europe and the United States. So that's where a lot of our vocabulary and conceptual categories come from. So real comparative work that is deeply empirically grounded is still very much called for and is behind an awful lot of the work that's positively cited by the other panelists. If there's any kind of shortcoming, as I say, it's in using conceptual categories that are based, as I suggest, not on not on real empiricism, but on an implicit and very idealized understanding of and a non-critical understanding of the historical experience of those societies.
Thanks a lot, Nathan. So we have a question from our friend Yusuf Shazli, which is rather one that is practical for like a young scholar like himself. And like myself as well, like we are not that, we are of the same age, even though we are not young anymore. So, this is a general question comment, so I guess it's addressed to the whole panel. The material foundations of academic research haven't really been addressed in this otherwise fascinating discussion, while there is a need to produce research that makes these regional processes seriously and hear from empirically rich and fieldwork grounded work, while sometimes departing from traditional or mainstream political science. How do we reconcile that with some of the requirements, notably publishing, in a particularly brutal academic job market? I was wondering if any of you had thoughts on that.
And Amr, yeah, can we have Amani also comment on Lisa's question?
Yes, of course, of course.
Absolutely. So I'm going to try to sort of maybe address both of them, because Lisa's question in terms of the pressures or the expectations on researchers to conduct work, where the field is, and how can students do, and scholars sort of continue working and producing publications. So my just to address the question Lisa raised, I find a trend in the field, which I hope we're sort of hopefully like on the tail end of, which is this obsession with identification and causal identification, right? So we're all interested in causality and thinking about, well, sequencing and what causes what. But I guess the hyper obsession with identification, which is that you have to precisely isolate a specific effect from a specific cause, and that should guide your whole empirical strategy and fieldwork approach. I think while there's valuable utility out of that, I just want to stand back and say, having thought about this, advised my own students, to have read numerous journal articles, it limits how we ask our questions. It limits the scope of how we think about politics. It limits sort of identification is important, but I think the type of empirical methods associated with identification lend themselves to really getting at small micro foundations and mechanisms. And like, for example, experimental work, really great at sort of adjudicating between these micro level mechanisms. But if you don't have grand theory going in and a solid understanding of what you're sort of working on, it's not going to aggregate upwards into something in terms of a solid contribution. So for Yusuf, also, you of course, we want all the younger generation to do very well and thrive and publish in their departments. My first advice I always give is the following, and I'm just going to take a moment, is that don't let the methods guide your research questions. In other words, you see what's published in maybe some of the journals or what your colleagues are publishing, and you might feel pressured, like, I'm going to just do a solid paper that is well identified. But once you start bogging yourself down into that sort of box, it just kills your creativity. And it kills the way you sort of think about the research enterprise and the research question. My suggestion is always ask the big question. Ask what really is going to get you in the gut. Ask what you think is really important as an expert in the region, and then ask yourself, okay, how can I answer these different components of the research question? You might want to come up with a well-identified research design on some parts of it, but other fat features of the research project. And this is really important also in the era of COVID and in the era where it's difficult and more difficult to do research in the region. There is no supplement for the solid interview. There is no supplement for just sitting down and listening to people and experts and your interlocutors in the field talk about what's going on. Getting on Zoom if you can't travel, and having that inform your research design is really, really important. Just going back to Lisa's question, I can go on and on like for 2 hours on this. I'm going to stop right here. But Lisa, I just want to say, and for everyone who's listening, who's still with us, I am often like almost dumbfounded when I see these projects that basically rely on over 1 million observations, well identified, to tell us something that we already knew based on one conversation in a coffee shop. So for students, younger generation, don't do that. Push the field forward. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Amani. So any of the panelists would be interested in addressing the question that was raised by Yusuf? You can all read it, right? I don't need to reread it again. The one on
well, I could
how
just,
this can be.
I can add something.
Please.
I can't answer completely, and it's a important question. I think the mainstream of the field is more complicated than some of the portrayals of it. I mean, I do think in comparative, we tend to think of comparisons in the classic, like structured comparisons or large N variation finding, what have you. But there's long traditions of people doing other kinds of comparative analyses to draw on. So it's not, you know, a vacuum out there that we're proposing things that haven't existed. And I wanted to mention a forthcoming volume that I have a chapter in, but it's called Rethinking Comparison by Erica Simmons and Nick Rush-Smith, and it's coming out in November from Cambridge. And it's going to be an incredibly valuable handbook for people who want to know how are other ways to compare. It's giving you some really practical models to it. But I just want to, sometimes it sounds so dominant, the structured comparison model, that if you're doing something different, you feel like you're going to go out there and no one's going to be able to comprehend what you're doing. I don't think that's the case. I do think you have to do work in making sure people who think that way can understand what it is you're trying to do. So you have to make your work legible to them. But I think you should do, you know, the work. I completely agree with Amani, and I know Yusuf's work, and it's extraordinary. So you don't need to adjust your work at all. But I think it's sort of making it, you know, legible to a wider audience, and that's something we all have to learn to do, regardless of our methodological approach.
Thanks a lot, Jillian. So there's the other question that was raised by Paul Arts on anti-presentist analysis, which I strongly favor. Can the panel speak a bit more on the poverty of protest, Dixit Magid Mandur, i.e. historical origins of the weakness of protest movements in the Arab world, Tunisia being partly an exception, weakness in particular in terms of like between brackets, lack of alternative visions on economic issues, especially youth unemployment. So Larissa, would you like to address the Tunisian exception?
Sure. Sorry, I was waiting if someone else wanted to answer first. So if I understood the question right, is the exception in terms of there's so much protest right now, or the exception that we didn't study protest before when it was going on, or both of them? I didn't understand the exception. I could look at the question. Sorry, I can look at the question.
Yeah. Well, I think it's about the weakness of like the poverty of protest. That there is a problem with the focus on protest to start with. Okay. This is what I got from the question, and correct me if I'm wrong.
So one of the things that has been really interesting, and I actually think there's a really strong and compelling literature on protest in Tunisia specifically, but also across North Africa that is in the making right now. So here I'm thinking of Chantal Berman's work. She's also looking at longue durée protest in comparison to Tunisia and Morocco on the kind of the work that's coming out right now. But in terms of the dearth of knowledge, so there is a lot of information on protests in Tunisia since 2011. In fact, there's an entire organization that formed in 2014 that collects protest data that has benefited a lot of scholars and provided data that has engaged to various different methodology and various different forms of protest, defining kind of what the category is, expanding what the category is. There's a lot of work by Tunisian PhD candidates and researchers and independent media outlets on precisely those protests. So an interesting thing that happened, an interesting kind of phenomenon that happened in 2011 and 2012, which saw one of the highest spikes of protest at the 10-year anniversary for lots of different reasons. There was what many called a political lockdown related to the public health condition, which lasted 4 days, which doesn't make sense. With kind of the public health concerns, locking down for 4 days doesn't work. So it was seen as a political lockdown to stop or to kind of not get people to go out and protest. And of course they did, and started engaging in these repertoires of nocturnal protests that also date to about 2016, but became a daily or nightly occurrence, if you will. There was, because of the inability of scholars and researchers to travel right now and do that kind of research, as Amani noted, there wasn't the kind of explosion of production that we saw around protests. So it was really so we were dependent on Tunisian media itself to report on it. But there's no such thing as a dearth. This is kind of one of the most exciting things about how Tunisians themselves have been reporting about the protests that they're witnessing, but also partaking in.
Can I add something on this point? And one of the things that's lost in looking at the uprisings is these sort of spatially and temporally bound units, which we're all speaking against, but we're all also seeing still out there in the literature. But is that we lose the understanding that some countries have long, rich histories of protest. And so uprisings in that context might be very different than, say, Syria, where you don't have an oppositional protest culture that's gone on for decades and decades. And so I think this sort of image that there's a dearth of protest is simply because, we're not necessarily reading the people that are writing about them. But there is a literature, there are people that have been following protests and writing about them in all the countries that have them. They just have been, I think, dominated, particularly in the 2000s, by the resilient authoritarianism literature. And so those of us who were writing about protest were getting kind of drowned out. But I think there's like Larissa's book documents how many protests there were in Tunisia, even under Ben Ali, all kinds of ways in which political dissent is expressed publicly. And so I think we can sort of push back against those portrayals with some more rich comparative analyses that take the long view that we're all advocating for. Lema.
Yeah, thank you.
Lema, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. So I wanted to add to this, and again, not as a scholar of protests by any means, but especially in this esteemed panel, but I do think that part of this perception of dearth or whatever might be seen as a sort of lack of historical might be partly because of what we're looking to see as protests, right? So the forms and the ways in which we expect mobilization to take place. And also, and Jillian, referenced this also in her talk, is also the sort of the looking at other subnational variation, and also looking kind of beyond capitals and central, where we expect sort of political mobilization to be happening based on European histories as well. But and I'm reminded here, and this is where I think interdisciplinary work is really important, of a. I was one of the first cohort of the Lebanon Research Summer Institute in Beirut in, I guess it was 2016, 2015, and learning, even myself as a scholar of Lebanon, about the sort of rich history, for instance, of protests of farmers and tobacco farmers in the south of Lebanon, in the Bekaa, and these forms of protest, women's movements, that didn't necessarily aim to have, large-scale political change in the way that we necessarily envision it. But, speaking to Lisa's point, that resistance need not be always in the shape that we expect it to be. And so I think, there's a lot there that can challenge this perception that we didn't have protest, historically.
Thanks a lot, Lema. Rabab, please.
Okay. I'm going to be very quick because we're running out of time and we still have a third question. I cannot underscore more and emphasize what Lema just said. But what catches my attention in this question, which is actually repeated, is to what extent we actually frame and narrate the region in a particular gaze. So, and this worries me. And I think this is why such a panel and such efforts to actually to reevaluate our graduate programs, how we do research, the kind of research questions we ask is quite important, because I'm worried that, 10, 20 years, 50 years down the road, a new form of Orientalism is being made, forming this, not just the Arab exceptionalism being reborn, but actually changing history. And to that effect, again, I think it's very important to understand that this also fits a narrative that power and counter-revolutionary forces in the region and elsewhere would like, it goes hand in hand with the idea that, we're not ready for this or that. So just wanted to say how, like point to the political ramifications of the research questions we choose. Thank you.
Rabab. Paul just wrote back clarifying something in the question, that he's saying that I'm not arguing that there were or are few protests. On the contrary, but try to refer to the lack of social content, i.e. poorly developed ideas, let alone programs on how to envision an alternative socio-economic order apart from the political order. So that's just like to clarify. So it's not that Paul was downplaying the presence of protests altogether. Like they have been there. But I think that one of the issues is really about how we conceptualize protest, what it is about there, because we might be risking superimposing some categories on the protests, on what is happening on the ground, either that these are for democracy or that these are class driven. And here comes the point that was raised by many of the political anthropologists on this panel of going to the ground, and not just to empirically like try to observe things, but also to understand how people on the ground are perceiving themselves. What are they demanding for? Which is, I think, a very basic and quite legitimate critique that usually came from the anthropological side to mainstream positivist political science, really. So that's the point. So Larissa, may I just actually read Muhammad Dia Hammami's question, because it relates to the other, and then I can give you the floor. Muhammad Dia is a fellow Tunisian, so I think you will find his question interesting as well. So Dia is saying, most studies of recent events in the region use terms like uprisings, revolution, revolt, transition in an almost interchangeable way. Do we need to look at these phenomena differently? If yes, what would be the methodological implications of such a differentiation? So Larissa, please.
So I want to respond quickly to Paul's question, and I think my colleagues would do wonderful responding to Mohammed, who obviously I know as well and have had multiple conversations with. I actually think that it is through the various different movements and protests, especially the ones that have occurred earlier this year at the almost kind of artificial category of 10 years, because they also obviously happened before and happen at different moments, particularly when a new finance law is passed or when a very unpopular government decision is taken at either pressure of international financial institutions, that the alternative politics that activists and citizens or individuals who are partaking in different movements are envisioning and calling for through those protests. So I think that in Paul's question, there's a bit of a, and please forgive me if I read this wrong, but I've heard this quite a lot in policy circles, that the vision for an alternative politics is missing. There's no such thing as an alternative program that someone is pushing forward. Yet within these different movements, there are so many different, within these movements, there's such a massive variety of alternative ways of life that are produced, from food sovereignty through environment, through health politics, that are oftentimes not necessarily taken into consideration in that larger question of what is the big economic plan that we expect every single political party to push forward, or that we expect the government to be somehow miraculously able to adapt. So I agree with Paul, and I think that a lot of the answer lies in the kind of grievances that are articulated in these various movements.
Thanks a lot, Larissa. So yeah, Jillian, please.
So yeah, so I think that the question of, what kind of concepts and terms we use are really important. And if you look in the social movement and protest literature, you'll find endless typologies of, different forms, and you can pick and choose whichever you like. For me, one of the issues is to listen what people on the ground understand themselves to be doing, and not necessarily to try to fit what they're doing into our concepts, but to listen to what they're doing. So just to give an example from Jordan, so the Jordan had this uprising in 2011, but no one in Jordan calls it a thawra. They'll talk about the thawra Misriya, thawra Tunisia, but not in Jordan. Some of them will call them like Iraq 2011, but otherwise it's not named. However, all of the massive austerity protests are named Hebbe, Hebet Nisan, Hebet Huzeran. And so they're marking them, they're using that kind of vocabulary. They're not calling them protests, they're calling them these kinds of events, to go back to Nathan's invoking of the eventful moments. So they'll mark them that way. And so instead of me putting it in the category based on the criteria I establish, I'm trying to listen to how they understand, what they understand particular things to be meaning, you know, what are protests and who's an activist? These kinds of, in the Arabic vocabulary, are really, really generative of interesting processes and insights.
Thanks a lot, Jillian. So I think time is up. Thank you very much, really, for making the time and effort. This was like an excellent panel. I enjoyed it personally quite a lot. And thanks, Lisa and Rabab, for well, for developing the concept and for holding this panel. Thanks a lot, like everybody attending and participating. And we look forward to having you all in upcoming events of the sort. Okay, thanks a lot. Enjoy your morning or your evening, and good night.